Okay, hello everybody. It looks like we are live. I'm just going to give it a few more minutes for some more people to come through. But for everybody who is here at the moment, please let me know if there is anything that you're looking forward to learning today about visual basics. So this masterclass and workshop is really about helping you elevate your branding. So if there's anything at all that's exciting to you about learning some of the visual basics when it comes to your own brand and running your business, let me know in the chat. Also, let me know how you're doing today. Hope everybody is well. If you're enjoying the weather, the sunny weather in Melbourne has been really nice. So feel free to say hello. There'll also be time at the end for questions. So we'll take questions towards the end once the presentation has finished. I'll go through any questions that you have. So feel free to drop it in the chat box and I'll get to that as we go through. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for signing up for this masterclass and workshop. It's such a delight to present something that I'm so passionate about when it comes to branding. And yeah, don't be shy. Feel free to drop a hello or let me know if there's anything that you're excited to learn about when it comes to the visual aspects of branding for your business. And even if you have questions now, please drop them in as we go along and I'll read through them towards the end of the presentation. So my name is ChunYan and I am a brand designer. So I am one of the mentors for the ASBAS Digital Solutions Program. So ASBAS does a range of workshops, well, it offers a range of really amazing workshops for small businesses. And we are currently doing webinars and lots of online workshops. So you also have the opportunity to grab up to 4 hours of paid mentoring, and these are wonderful. They're such good value for money. So it's really $2 2 hours for $25. It is subject to availability though, so we still have a number of spots available. So book in fast because these positions or these spots are limited and there's lots of mentors. So we help you in running your business from a digital perspective. So I look after branding, I'm a brand designer, and so that's just something that I offer as part of the ASBAS Digital Solutions Program. So let's get started. I'll jump right into the workshop. So I'm also as well as being a brand designer, I'm also a coach and an author. I really work with small businesses in the food, wellness, and the holistic space. So these tend to be businesses who are newly established or have been in business for a number of years. And I do everything from the brand design aspect of things all the way up to coaching as well. So I also work with designers and coach them in running their own coaching design business. So it's lovely to meet you. So a little bit about me, I actually didn't start off as a brand designer. I was a chemical engineer. So I went to school for 6 years. It was a double degree, so it took a long time. It was for chemical engineering and science, as well as graphic design. So there's such a mishmash of different things, but I think my mind is a little bit like that. I like to work from a very logical perspective, but I also love the creative side of business as well. So I ended up doing marketing and branding. I really specialize in product and packaging development. And I have worked with global brands such as Unilever. I've worked with Twinings, and there's a local brand called Loving Earth, which is more of a ethical chocolate brand. So basically, I followed my stomach around when it came to my career. I really worked with brands that were very much in the food industry or fast-moving consumer goods industry. And I'm really excited, I guess, even back then, I was really passionate about rebrands and packaging and product development. And nowadays, I'm the owner of my own brand design studio. So we do everything from branding to the implementation of that brand. So on websites and on packaging as well. So what you'll learn today, and this was something that I thought a lot about when I was crafting this presentation and workshop, is I wanted to hopefully inspire you to feel very excited about the visual aspects of branding for your business, because there's a real importance for having a strong visual brand when it comes to running a business. When we instantly think of brands and ones with strong branding, it's probably there are a number of brands that kind of come to mind. So I would ask you to immediately think of ones that you think represents what strong visual branding means. And often you'll find that these brands stick in your mind because it's not so much just the visual aspect, but there's a whole lot of other things that's happening there as well. It's really the emotional side, it's the visual aspect of it. It is an ecosystem that is really built into branding. So for today, we're just looking at the visual side of things. Some of the other workshops will also focus on the less visual aspects of branding as well. But I really want you to get out of today's session to understand how to build a brand that really connects with your best customers to leave that lasting impression, and understand why that's important. That sometimes when we brand our own businesses, it's not just about branding what we think is going to work for our business or what we like and the colors that we like, but it's the things that really resonate with our best customers. They're the ones that is going to make the final purchase decision or the decision to work with you. So you really want to make sure that you're looking after your best customers through every single decision that you make. We're also going to run through the top essential visual elements to get right for your brand. And we are going to go through how to choose things like typography, imagery, color, the color palette, how to work with your logo. So must-dos when it comes to working with your logo and how to apply it as well. So this class will be recorded, and it is recorded at the moment. So just keep that in mind if you want to go back and revisit some of the content. It will always be available for you to do as well. So this isn't right. This next actions is actually for later. So it should say free worksheets. I think it's got a little bit scrambled in there, but I'll have some free worksheets at the end, and we'll provide the link in the chat. Once the presentation is over, you can actually use those worksheets to move through a lot of the prompts that I'm going to share with you today, because there is a lot of questions and deeper reflection that's really going to help you through this process of visual branding. So your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. So that was a quote from Jeff Bezos, and it's really true because it's really the impression that you leave behind. So if you think about those big brands that you really love, it's the feeling and the impression that they leave even once you've stopped using the product, right? Even if you stopped working with that particular person or that particular company, you still have an impression of how it made you feel. And so this is something that we want to explore a little bit more of today. So why should you elevate your branding? Like, what's the purpose of these workshops? Well, it's really about giving your best customers or your clients a key reason or a number of reasons to buy from you, because you're speaking directly to them. It's also going to help repeat encourage repeat purchase from those customers or clients, or it might not be purchase, but they might want to work with you again if you're creating a service, if your offering is service-based, or they'll recommend you to others. And sometimes those testimonials are so effective. So by elevating your branding, you're really giving your ideal customers and clients a path to purchase, right? So it's helping them make that decision to choose you and your business over someone else or over another business. And when we're looking at the different components that make up your brand, you've got so many different things here. And this is what I was saying before about how different aspects will always come into play when you're looking at defining your brand. It's not just your logo, right? So your logo sits under visual identity. So it's really important to understand that that is just one very small part of your brand. There are so many other aspects that make up how your brand moves and behaves in the world. So for today's masterclass and workshop, we're actually going to touch on a few of these. We're going to touch on customer, personality and impact, positioning, and visual identity. And in the other workshops for the same series, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the other things that we're not covering today, such as the voice messaging, values, mission, and vision as well. So let's have a look at how this all comes into play. So we're going to go through the different steps in terms of helping you craft your visual brand. And when we're looking at those steps, we're really looking at the different elements that you're going to get at the end of it. So this is your logo and your icons. You've got your color palette. This is the typography. So typography is also known as fonts. So the different fonts that you'll use in your brand. Illustration and imagery and textures. And also layouts as well. So how are all of those images, or how are all of those elements positioned together? So if you think about a website, there's a specific layout that is there, right? It's been designed in a way so that the logo appears on the left and the color palette comes through and maybe the links or the buttons that you click. This could also be layout on packaging, for example. So where does your logo go? Where does the text go? How does everything work together to convey the message that you want to convey? So those are the 5 main things that we're going to look at when it comes to the visual elements. But there's actually a number of steps. There's 10 steps to get there. And some of these things are not necessarily jumping straight into the visual aspect. One of the things that I really would love to inspire you to delve into further is to understand some of the things that create a really strong foundation for your brand. So before you go into the visual side of things, because that is almost the last part of it, we really want you to understand step 1, your brand personality. So this is who you are as a brand. If your brand was a human being, how would it make other people feel? How would they connect to you through your personality? And this is a really helpful metaphor to understand or see your brand as a human being, because we are dealing also with humans on a day-to-day level, right? And so where we want to make those connections is human to human first. So the more humanized your brand is, the more emotional that experience is going to be, and the deeper the impression is going to be. So that's why it's really important to start with the personality and how something feels. So these are some of the worksheet prompts that you'll move through once this class is finished, and these will be available as part of the downloadable free worksheets, which are part of the Google Docs document that you'll get at the end. So don't feel like you have to go through these as we go along. These are all prompts to keep in mind that you can work through yourself when you have a bit more time. So the first prompt is, what are 5 words that best describe your brand's desired personality? The importance here is to focus on the desired personality, because where your brand currently is, there's probably some place that you want your brand to change into. So you want it to transition into a slightly different version of your brand, or you could be very happy with your current personality, brand personality, which is fine as well. But if you're in the midst of a refresh or a rebrand, you're really wanting to focus this question on your brand's desired personality. Where do you want to get to? Who do you want to be? Or who does your brand want to be at the end? So for example, some of the words that describe one of the brands that I'm going to show you today is expressive, connected, embodied, powerful, curious. These were all words that came through in one of the workshops that I did with the client. And I'm going to use that project as an example to show you how these steps have helped her craft her visual brand. Step 2 is to clarify your core values. Now, this is really important because it's really about what do you believe in. So this is not necessarily your personal beliefs, but it's the beliefs and the values of your brand. How does it operate within your business? What values actually guide your brand and business to move forwards or to make decisions every day? So these may be decisions based on if you're a product-based business, it might be the materials that you use. What type of materials are you using, and what are those values? What are those values that are actually guiding your decisions? So if you're an eco-friendly brand and eco-friendly was one of your values, or sustainability was the key core value of yours, then you're going to choose materials and ingredients that are ethical and sustainable. So what core values actually guide how you run your business and grow your brand? So for example, connection, depth, and practice were the things that kept coming through for my client when she was working on her brand. So when she was looking through practice, it was always about this desire to continue to reiterate or refine the things that she knew and how she shared her content and her service to her clients. Now, step 3 is getting to know your ideal customers. So this is about who you champion in the world. And this is so important because really they're the reason why your brand exists. Without your best customers or your ideal customers, your brand wouldn't exist because there's no purpose for them to serve anyone. So this is why it's really important to dive deep into the ideal customer work. Who are you for and who do you serve? And again, it's about that human to human connection. So as an example, your brand could be like Apple is, it's for the creative misfits, right? Or it could be for urban survivalists. It could be the trailblazers, or it could be for coffee lovers. There are certain groups where you can really be very specific about the people that you champion. And the reason why we want to be a little bit more specific about this is not because well, typically it gets very difficult if you aren't able to speak to anyone in particular. If you're trying to speak or reach to a lot of different people or a lot of different industries or groups of people, it's going to be very difficult for you to refine your messaging and refine things like the color palette or the type of typography that you're going to use. All those decisions are going to be a lot more complex. But the more structured or the more refined you are able to define, how you're able to define your ideal client or your ideal customer, the easier those decisions will become later down the line. So for example, if you're able to create something for coffee lovers, you probably have an immediate, I guess, intuitive thought of what coffee lovers would like, right? Well, what would they enjoy? What kind of setting would they like? What kind of style would they be into? The more you can get into the head of the people that you serve, the more you're able to create a product, a brand, a service, and an offering that is really tailored for them. And that's where the human to human connection comes in. So I want you to describe your ideal client or your ideal customer in as much detail as possible. So the prompts in the worksheet will guide you through some of the demographics, the psychographics, the lifestyle, their interests and hobbies, what stage of life they're in, what are their daily habits, their aspirations and their goals, and their beliefs and their values. So this is really about creating as much information as possible so that you're able to understand how your ideal client and customer thinks, feels, and acts in the world. So all of these things actually can influence how they make decisions and what they actually want to see when it comes to your brand. How do they see that your brand is going to serve them? This is how you're able to connect, because you're really crafting a brand for the people that you want to serve. So if their values are XYZ, you're going to make sure that that is really part of your value systems as well, or that's something that you're going to focus a little bit more of your energy on when it comes to your business. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, great. Okay, what do you want to change in their life? What do they want to change in their life that your business can help them with? And who do they want to become, and how do they want to feel? I just want to spend a little bit of time understanding this question, or going through this question, because I think it's really important. And this is because you want to ensure that your brand is going to help them change from their current state. So this is your ideal customer's current state, what they may be dealing with on a day-to-day basis, to where they want to be in life. How is your brand actually helping them transition or move towards the person they want to become? And it could be something really simple, right? It could be, if you were a honey brand, a brand that makes honey, it could be about creating this wholesome ritual where they look forward to sitting down in the morning because they are able to make a beautiful tea and add some honey into it, or they know that they're going to be nourishing their bodies because the honey comes from a sustainable honey farm. I don't know that much about honey farms, or beekeeping, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight or context into why that helps paint the picture, because they're actually connecting with this vision of your business in that way, the vision of your brand. Who do they want to become? What are the things that your brand and your offerings can actually help them with when they transition towards this next version of themselves? So this is really their aspirational state. These are the little goals that they might have. These are the objectives. This is how they want to feel. So for my client, her brand, she is a somatic coach. So her brand is all about helping people feel more confident in their decisions and speaking up. So that's the example. All right, next. What do they like about your brand? What do they dislike about your brand? And what would they want you to change or improve? Now, this is really interesting because it's great to understand what it is that your customers currently resonate with, and what they would like to actually make tweaks on. So often we may actually make a lot of business decisions without really understanding what it is that our customers want us to change. So this is a really good example of maybe asking your customers or your clients some of these questions so that you're able to understand what are the things that you might want to change? What are the things that they already really resonate with? And what are some of the things that they might not resonate with? So maybe as my client's example, this was the fact that they found her brand too loud and in your face. So they didn't want it to be so confronting. They wanted something that was a little bit more softer and not so bombastic. So it's really great to get some feedback, some testimonials, and understand exactly what comes through in customer and client research. So all of this is really setting you up for a really cohesive visual brand. And I want you to describe your ideal customer as a specific person, not a group. So we spoke about this already. That is really important to get clear. And as you are reducing it down from a group, you want to be as specific as possible. So the more that you can whittle this further down into a specific person, the better this is going to be. So you can create more than one ideal customer if required. Some brands do have more than one ideal customer. It is a little bit more complex because then you have to balance the needs of all of those ideal customers. So for example, your brand might have a current customer that you love to serve. You might have new customers that you would love to serve in future that you're trying to bring in. Or they might be customers that actually purchase a specific offering that you have. So when you have more than one ideal customer, the tip here is to really select something that is, or highlight the similarities between these groups, and that will make it a little bit easier for you. What brands do they love or are they loyal to? What is it about these brands they resonate with? So you're going to look at this based on their core values, the core values that they are resonating with, the personality that your ideal customer resonates with within these brands, and also what is it about their visuals. So maybe, for example, with Nike, it's that feeling or the personality of things happening. It's that active nature, or this the value of health and looking after your body, or nutrition, right? So these are some of the things that you would probably need to spend a little bit of time investigating and exploring. And you're actually going to move through this in the worksheet. It's actually going to help you define all of these things. So you're going to go through down the list and you're going to see if you can identify what those values are, what the feeling is, what are the similarities in the logo and the icons, what is the similarity or the trends that you're seeing in the color palette that they're using, or in the fonts, in the illustration and the imagery and in the layout. This is really important because it's going to help you break down and dissect the visual styles that you keep seeing when it comes to the things that your ideal customer resonates with. So let's have a look at an example. So this is something that my client researched. So we moved through this process together. We picked some of the brands that her ideal customer resonated with. So they tend to be feminine, but there is a depth in the photography, right? There is a dark, so it's like sort of darker photography rather than light and bright. There is a simplicity in the layout. It's really clean, minimal. The logos are really simple. There's not a lot of decoration. There's a lot of focus on earth or the greenery. It's this real ode to simplicity, grounding. It feels practical but intentional. And so when we actually break this down in the exercise, we're moving towards the core values of honesty, trust, community, and feelings of being supported, feeling safe, understood, confident. And then when it comes to the logo, you're actually going to break it down to the logos that maybe you see your ideal customer loving. And in this case, it was minimal, clean, crisp logos, really simple, typographic, but very simple in its arrangement. There's a little bit of symbolism in there. Tends to be warm, and when it comes to the earthy contemporary colors, you're looking at typography and fonts which are really functional and they're not highly decorative. And when it comes to illustrations and imagery, you're seeing a lot of very subtle textures and raw type photography that has that depth to it. The layout tends to be clean, spacious, and quiet, not in your face, and it feels really uncluttered. So this is an exercise that is so worth doing because it will allow you to actually compare what your ideal customer wants to see and what they currently resonate with. So this fourth step is really about elevating that and adding your own point of differentiation. And this is what makes people want to purchase your brand or work with you. This is why they'll choose to work with you, because of your point of difference. What does your brand offer that is unique and sets you apart from the competition? So first of all, it's really important to understand who your competition is and what are these brands doing visually. So we want to actually research the same way that we did the previous work. We want to research the visual branding of similar brands or your competition. So instead of researching the brands that your customer really loves, we're actually going to focus that research this time on your competition. So this is going to tell you how you need to actually differentiate with them in mind. So as an example, here are some of the similar brands that came through in the research. So for my client, she is a coach. So we looked at a number of different coaching websites, different coaching logos, or brand identities created for coaches. And what you can see is generally probably is a similarity of sorts. And how I typically do this is I kind of take a step back to see if I can see everything from a wider perspective. And I start looking at the things that I see which are similar. So as you can see, there is probably the first thing that I see is maybe this script typeface or the script font that looks like handwriting. So that tends to be something that is similar in a lot of these different websites. They all have some sort of script typeface that is quite prominent. So there's the hey girl, there is the script that comes through in the icon or the logo. There is also happy, bold, bright photography. It tends to be lighter in color, so there's a lot of white as the background for websites. There's a lot of pink and sort of softer colors as well. There's not so many. There's also a corporate blue. There's like a navy that's coming through, which is really interesting. So that tends to make me feel like some of these brands want to feel a little bit more corporate or a little bit more businessy. And I think generally what we tend to find with these is that for the websites, they tend to have a header with someone's photo on it. So these are all the things that I'm picking up. In terms of logos, there is quite a variation. There is logos which are highly detailed. So the one down the bottom on the left-hand side is highly detailed. There's also ones which are very simple with just the name and some of the typography in there with using the script handwriting. So that I don't feel there is that much of a trend, but certainly for some of the other things, you can definitely see the trends coming through. There's also a lot of space around everything. And this tends to be, I would say there's clutter in some of those in terms of how things are overlaid. This in terms of the collages, it's a little bit more artistic in its style, even though there is a lot of white space on the website layouts. So that would be my initial summary or gut instinct when I look at some of the research that comes through. So we're actually going to break it down in the same way that we did before. So again, asking those questions around the core values, defining and breaking down the feelings, the personality, the visual identity. Now, don't just use their websites. Also look at your competitor or similar brand social media, packaging, wherever they have branding. It is a really good opportunity to explore that and almost create this kind of mood board that lets you see it all visually together. So when we look at similar brands, we kind of went through this already, but their core values tend to be around this feeling of empowerment, this bright, bubbly energy, which is very positive. It's also about connection, community. The feeling tends to either be gentle or soothing and sort of that pink, softer feeling, or it is a little bit louder, it's a little bit bolder and motivational. When it comes to the logo and the icons, there is a little bit more variation around this, as we spoke about before. So script typefaces, as we said before. It's also, sometimes you can see these businesses use a lot of circular stamps in their icons as well, in their logos. And when it comes to the color palette, we found that they tended to be peaches, soft pinks, purples, or there was this like intense bold fuchsia that kept coming through, and lots of corporate navy, indigo, and blues. And the typography was italicized serif fonts, lots of serif fonts with handwritten script. That tended to be the trend that a lot of these websites and brands were inspired by. And when it came to illustration and imagery, we actually saw lots of kind of cutesy icons, or just not necessarily cutesy, but they were like, I would say cute icons that were bright, and also using a lot of bold colors to highlight things on the page. There was this intensely happy photography, really confident photography of the people themselves. So if you're a product-based brand, you might notice very different things, because this is obviously for a service rather than a product-based brand, but your photography might reveal certain things in terms of how the products are positioned in photography. And how the lighting is, like look at all of those things and dissect or deconstruct what each of those elements is all about. And when the place that the photography is really taken tends to be in their office, their desk, or in nature. So lots of beachy shots. And when it came to the layout, we did see a number of artistic collage style layouts, so decorative styles, decorative layouts, which I didn't show in the sort of the few that I put up on the previous slide, but they were definitely a theme that we captured. Large headers featuring large headers featuring the people's faces, or photography of the people themselves. So those tended to be the things that we were able to find when we were looking at all the research. You may actually find a lot more than this. This is really simple, sort of distilled version of what actually came through in our workshop. We actually had a lot more notes, and it really created a much deeper picture because you're able to dissect it a lot more based on the amount of research that you have. So I wouldn't be afraid to delve into this and actually deconstruct what these similar brands have that are similar. And now it's really up to you to define what makes you different. So now that you understand what visually makes all these brands similar, I want you to think about how you can actually make yours different so that you can really connect with your ideal customer and client. This is super exciting because I often find this to be the most challenging part of the visual branding exercise, but it's really the thing that makes your brand impressionable and memorable from a visual perspective. So for example, for my client, she wanted to feel like her brand came across as intuitive. There was this feeling of creativity or intuition, reflection, but it was still very grounded. She also wanted to play with the concept of duality. So that was something that kept coming through, this feeling of balance between creativity and flow versus structure and foundation and grounding. And what you'll see is in our visual brand, we actually brought some of these things into her visual brand. And this is really what created a very strong foundation for her branding. So this hopefully helps you understand the necessity to go through these steps before actually diving straight into design and implementation. So how can you visually convey what makes your brand different? So I want you to emphasize your point of difference based on your personality, values in a way that resonates with your ideal customers and clients. So keep your ideal customers and clients in mind. So this was what we did in the beginning. So you'll see the 3 columns. So you'll have your ideal clients. So this was a summary of everything that we've done initially. So when we were looking at what our ideal clients' preferences were in the brands that they really resonated with. And then the middle column is similar brands. So this is the exercise I just showed you before. So what are all the things that keep coming up with the similar brands visually? And then I start to define my client's brand. So this is where you will also start to define your brand and differentiate it. So what you'll be able to see is that I think the key in here is you don't want to go completely extreme and differentiate it so much that your ideal client finds it really difficult to associate it back to the similar brands. There is already a sort of an industry expectation of what coaches and coach brands would look like, for example. So there's almost this visual language that exists. It's interesting, or it's important to keep that in mind, because if you create something that's super different, that brand, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, but it'll take a bit more time for you to warm up your audience. It'll take a bit more time for you to get your message through. So my thoughts are sometimes it's good just to have your brand be slightly reminiscent of it, not completely, of course. You want to take some references from what the industry trend is looking like without being trendy. It's a funny one, but it's about playing with that balance. So for example, in my client's brand, her values were really strong. So she came through with connection, depth, and practice, which is similar to some of the competitor brands. They also had connection. Practice was something that she was really going to help her differentiate the type of content and how her brand looks and feels as well. The feeling and personality, she wanted to feel a little bit more mature or refined and contemplative. So it's a little bit more, it's not gentle, but it's more refined in a sense of contemplation. So I hope that makes sense. These typically are going to be very subtle shifts. They're not going to be huge jumps from each other. So she's still going to be, she still have that element of gentleness, but it comes across as through a lens of maturity. And there is a calmness to how she moves about in her world. And so there's a calmness in her brand as well. Her logo and icons, I think we loved the fact that her ideal client loved this minimal, clean, crisp aspect of things. So that was just something that we wanted to continue bringing into her brand. When it came to the earthy and warm colors that her ideal client loved, we iterated on that, and we actually are going to go a little bit darker. There is a depth. So this is where the depth comes in, because her color palette actually has some of those darker tones in it. She also brings some of the brighter, warmer colors, because some of the similar brands have this sort of like a brighter, bold pops. We've really toned it down in our example or in our project, but this was a wonderful example of how we're kind of finding the balance between the two. And this is going to be different for your business and your brand, and it's going to be a little bit of a play, right, to see what you're going to take and what you're going to iterate on. When it comes to typography, I wanted her to feel like she had a lot of foundation and grounding. There is a solidness and conviction in how she speaks. So it really needed to be represented in the typeface or the fonts that we chose. So they tend to be very simple. They are quiet in a way that it's quietly confident. And we've chosen, we've used script very, very minimally. It's used maybe once on her website rather than being something that is in her logo. So that's how we're differentiating it from the other similar brands. And then when it comes to illustration and imagery, we've really refined this a little bit more. So instead of having those cute icons, we're actually going with really simple minimalist symbols. So I'll show you how that all comes together in the next slides, but we're really refining this down. We've also kept subtle textures, and her photography tends to be inspired by nature. So there is this depth of nature coming through rather than this bright sort of nature. There tends to be a little bit more depth and layering in the photography that we've chosen for her. And when it comes to the layout, we wanted spacious layouts which have a degree of gridded structure, because her brand is all about playing with that energy of flow and structure, flow and grounding. So the spaciousness allows for that flow, but the structure and the gridded nature of her website actually shows, and her brand actually creates that sense of foundation and grounding. And we've specified no header portraits because that is another point of differentiation. So this is something that I would encourage you to spend a bit more time with, because once you've got this, you can start using it to guide your decisions when it comes to the visual expression of your brand. So what we're going to do now, before we move on to this, it's really just to sum this all up. It's about finding that sweet spot between your brand and what your ideal customer likes. So you want to be able to find that, I guess, what your brand represents, and then really come to meet where your customers' preferences are, so that you can really dial into that without really losing aspects of who you are. So branding is really interesting because it's always about playing with the balance of all of these aspects of who it is that you are, who you serve, and the industry that you are in. So I would also say with similar brands, sometimes you can go into the middle section where the Venn diagram intersects, everything intersects, just because you want to be taking cues from what's already established in the industry. So I would say anything within that section is still fine, but keep in mind not to follow all the trends that are there. Just take inspiration from it, use it sparingly, but really hone in on what your ideal customer likes and how you can be differentiated. So hopefully that works. All right, so let's continue. So the next step from defining or breaking down what makes you different and really finding your X factor is you're going to start visualizing what this looks like. So I've broken it down from a word perspective or in a table, but now it's really about creating a mood board. Now, sometimes you can do the mood board first. If you're visual, you might want to do this step before actually deconstructing it, and then you'll refine the mood board again after that. With my clients, I tend to strategically look at the differentiation and then we create the mood board together, but it's really up to you. So work with what works with how you see the world. So if you're visual and mood boarding is something that instantly resonates with you, that's probably a good place to start before you start deconstructing the things that make your brand different. So in the mood board, you're going to be referencing branding, packaging, design, imagery, anything visual that really anchors back to the things that we spoke about before. So in the previous slide, what makes you different? What are all those elements that we're looking for? The warmer colors, the earthier tones, the darker color palette, references to nature, very subtle textures. Those are the things that you want to keep an eye out for when it comes to creating this mood board, or essentially the creative direction for your brand. This is the part that I really love, because it's really about seeing all of the research come together in a very strategic way, but that is also creative as well. So you're going to reference lots of different things. That's why it's not just about looking at your industry, it's about looking outside your industry, because there's so many different things that can inspire your creative directions. So feel free to broaden your horizons in this particular step. The thing that I love using is Pinterest, and Pinterest really helps build mood boards very effectively. And this is an example of the mood board that I've created. This is something that we've created with my ideal client. Not my ideal client, with my client, sorry. So she selected some of the images. I also refined this a little bit further. And as you can see, this is visually giving us a very clear direction of where we want to head for her visual brand. We've started selecting some of the colors, the color palette, the types of textures, the type of imagery. We love this idea of the sun coming through in some of her imagery. There's this brightness, but there's still this layering and depth as well. There is this metaphor for all the layers of work that she does with her clients. So we've used a lot of typography kind of imagery to help symbolize that. And some of the layouts, as you can see, tend to be very simple and clean. So this step really needs to be a reflection of all the things that you listed in the table. And if it doesn't really feel right, I would go back and really refine your mood board. So really stick to maybe 30 images. Anything more than 30 images is going to be too much, because you want to be very distilled and very selective with the things that are definitely going to be right for your brand. They can't just be kind of right. They pretty much need to hit the nail on the head when it comes to the visual aspects of it. And of course, you don't have to be taking it literally, it doesn't mean that you're going to take the colors exactly, but you need to be very specific about where it is in those images that you choose that anchors back into the look and feel of your brand. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if there's any questions so far, because it is a lot to take in, and these steps are very important. So please use the chat to, let me know if there's any questions or anything that is not clear so far. So once you've done the mood board, and this could actually take a little bit of time, so don't rush through the mood boarding step, we start to define the different things. So we're starting to define the color palette, the typography, the logo, the layouts, the imagery and illustrations and textures. So we're going to start firstly with the color palette. And I'm starting with the color palette mainly because I think it's the easier one to start with, because typically our brands already have some sort of color. It's probably the first thing that we start to define when it comes to our brands. So it's probably a good place to start as well. So I want you to have a think about what colors actually represent your brand when you're defining your color palette. And it's just something to think about when you're actually going through the decision-making process around color palette. So you might be influenced by sort of where we were before. We liked earthier tones, we liked olives, and darker greens. But now we're actually giving a little bit more definition to the colors. We're selecting the colors specifically rather than as a group of colors. So what you need to do is you can start by defining your brand's primary color. This is the first step because you're really going to choose the main color that your brand will be known for, that you're going to use the most often. And your color palette can be influenced by things such as the industry. So the industry that your brand is in or the business that you're in can very well have a influence on the primary color that you choose or the color palette that you choose. If it is industry related, or if you're choosing it based on the industry, I would also take a little bit of I would also note that maybe it's good just to choose a very different accent color. So a color that pairs with your primary color as an accent color. I would choose something that is quite different to what that industry expectation is, just so again, you have that differentiation. If it's based on product or ingredient, you can again choose a very different accent color to differentiate your brand. Emotional psychology can be an influence or a way of choosing your colors. And I would say be inspired by this, but don't get too literal. So if pink is love, or red is love, or red is power or intensity or anger, you don't have to get so literal in the actual emotions of it. You can be inspired by it. Or you could break the rules altogether. So for the example, I'm just going to show you one of each so we have a clear understanding of what that means. So this is colors based on industry, category, or segment. As an example, this is natural, organic, eco-friendly products. They typically are the skincare, in the skincare industry, and the segment is really earthy or organic skincare or organic products. As you can see, probably there are so many other examples out there that you can kind of imagine or have seen before, where green is used a lot when it comes to this particular industry of skincare and wellness. Green is used in everything from packaging to logos to labels. It instantly gives people that feeling of where this product or where this brand belongs. So this can really influence the colors that you may end up choosing. And you could also be influenced by the product, ingredient, or material. So this is an example of all the tomato ketchups. And we're not just looking at the packaging, but it's interesting. The packaging shape and the bottles are all really similar too. So again, it's really creating this particular language, visual language for this product that people expect. But if you look at the labels of the packaging itself, there is typically red and green. Isn't that interesting? Everything has red and green in it, right? So it goes to show that this product has a very established visual language. And when I say choose a different accent color, I would probably go with red, but maybe instead of green, I would use a different color just so you stand out a little bit more on shelf, but you still fit within the product or the category, or the product or the ingredient and material. And this is a little bit harder to see, but in the notes that you'll get after this, you could probably zoom in, but it shows the different psychology or the different emotions that are typically associated with these colors. So for certain brands that are, for example, yellow, typically it represents optimism, warmth, happiness, creativity, intellect, extroversion, and there's a list of negatives as well, but we don't typically see that in brands because brands typically want to put their best foot forwards when it comes to their brand identity. So you would probably just look at the positive. You would always look at the positive, actually. But hopefully that gives you an idea of what it would look like if you chose your colors based on psychology. So the reason why we chose the earthier colors for my clients' branding is really because it created this sense of grounding. And we used probably psychology and emotions when it came to making that decision. It was really about understanding the sort of connection back to nature as well, but also about how it made her feel and how it made her clients and the people that really resonated with her brand feel. It felt really calming. It felt really grounding. And you'll see that, well, you'll see that in one of the next slides. So the must-haves for color palette is one main primary color. So make sure you have your main primary color. So this is really for consistent recognition. An accent color, highlights to draw attention to your brand. And you also want to keep in mind a light neutral color as well as a dark neutral color as well. So there's going to be one that you're going to use for backgrounds, which is the lighter neutral color, and then a dark neutral color like black, charcoal, gray, which is going to be used for text. So let's have a look at an example. So this is the example of the color palette, the full color palette for the brand I was working on. There's a little bit more than just the 4 colors here because we've actually got a number of accents. So you can always have more, but I think as a starting point, you want to have at least 4. So what you can see is we've got a primary color of deep moss. So that's the moss green. We've also got an olive green and a sienna, which are the accents. We've got a secondary color as well, which is also a bit of an accent color in the pink lake and the river stone. So those, I would say, if we had to take the brand back to 4 colors, I would take out the secondary colors and I would just go with the deep moss and the olive green. So you would have primary color, accents, and then I would have the one neutral background. So in this particular case, I've got a porcelain and a ceramic because on her website, we have different variations of lighter toned backgrounds and something that is a little darker. So that's why we've got 2. And then for her neutral foreground color or her neutral dark color, we're using black. So we didn't show it here because it was just something that is typically comes with her branding anyway, just to have the black and the white as well. But I would define those 4 colors to start your color palette, and you can always refine from there. So the main consideration, so here's some best practices, is to ensure that you have enough contrast for color differentiation. So if you're putting your 2 colors on top of each other, you should be able to see it without going funny, without it like irritating your eyes or going a bit funny so that the colors are blurring together. So the first 2 examples on the left and the middle example, there's not enough contrast here. You're going to opt for something that is going to have higher contrast, which is the third option. Also consider the fact that some people might have color blindness, so they might not be able to differentiate between certain colors. So that's just something to think about as well. Tip number 2 is that you could use a color wheel, a harmony wheel, to find the other accent colors. And this will allow generally for the more of that contrast because they're on opposite ends or on different parts of the wheel. So if they're really close together, like if they're analogous, which is the bottom middle option, you're going to run into some issues with contrast. So I would stay away from the analogous pairings. I would also stay away from the monochromatic pairings because again, they're on the same segment of the wheel or very similar segment of the wheel. So you're not going to get enough contrast. If you're going with something like complementary, split complementary, triadic, or double complementary, then those should give you enough contrast with your color pairings. So that's just something to consider. And then tip number 3 is that you could use a resource such as Pinterest or Colors or Coolers for more color palette ideas. And so these are really great resources just to keep in mind. So step 7. So this step is all about defining your font. It's the visual basics for fonts. And we're going to start by defining your brand's primary typeface again. So it's the same process. So what you did for your color, which was around choosing your primary brand color, you're going to do the same thing when it comes to your typeface. Start with your primary typeface. Choose it based on the emotion, the feelings or personality that you want your brand to convey and be known for. Each font will have a different personality trait, and it's so subtle, but it's such an art. And I love the intricacies of choosing a typeface, because choosing the right one for your brand for me, it's like visual perfection. And what you're going to do is select a few complementary fonts to pair with that. And that will actually create a little bit more layering and complexity for your brand. But first up, we're going to start with the one. And each typeface will have a different type of personality. So you kind of want to see your brand or your font, almost as if they are people. And every font will kind of have a different characteristic, or they'll have a different personality. So if you look at the script typeface, for example, that flowing effect gives me this feeling of this really artistic woman, very theatrical, quite dramatic, really carefree. That's the sort of personality that I'm seeing when I look at that type of script face. The sans serif, the Acne Studios one, is fairly quiet, but there is still a dignity to it. There's still structure within those, within the shapes of the letters. Some of the things that you could look at is how the letters actually end. Like, is there a sort of curve at the end, like the highlights that you see on the Defear word? So I've got the little pink circles, which kind of highlight the little ends. Those little twiddles at the end typically denote sort of that ornate decorative style. Certainly serif typefaces tend to have more of a classical, more austere presence, more elegance. Acne Studios, the sans serif typeface, tends to have more of a modern, contemporary look and feel. It's a little bit more open, it's a little bit more friendly. So that's generally the difference between serif, sans serif, and script. I would say that with serif, the serifs always have those little legs, so where those magenta circles are, that's how you define if something is a serif typeface, because they have the little legs at the end, or the ligatures. Whereas with something like a sans serif, it's really clean. So Helvetica, Arial, or sans serifs, they don't have legs at the end or little feet at the end. That's how you can tell the difference. And serifs, here are some of the ones that I love. So Playfair, Butler, Garamond, Baskerville, Bodoni are all really beautiful serifs to start with. So this is a really great starting place to choose one of these. Or you could go to something like Google Fonts for free fonts. Otherwise, you will have to pay a license to use a particular typeface. And certain serifs that I love are Montserrat, Avant-Garde, which is this lovely open, really friendly sans serif. Italian Plate, which is really narrow and has that sort of feeling of the sort of license plate, the kind of registration type fonts, so very long and elongated, but it has like a old-fashioned feel to it. Avenir, which is a beautiful, very refined typeface. Brandon Grotesque for something a little bit more punchy. Futura, which is quite blocky, and Helvetica New. So those ones are ones that I would really recommend to start off with if you're having difficulty finding a primary font. And scripts I love Hamira, Autumn Chant, and Oliver Quinn. I typically go to Creative Market for the script typefaces just because I like the look and feel of some of the ones that are on Creative Market. Script typefaces are typically things that you want to use very sparingly though, because visibility or readability for script typefaces tends to be a lot lower than trying to read a sans serif or a serif typeface. If you had a whole body of text in scripts, it's going to be really hard for anyone to use. So just something to steer clear of for your brand, not to make this your body typeface or your paragraph typeface. And I would say, as a general rule, best practice, don't use more than 3 families. In some cases, people would recommend even 1 font family, and that's really great because you could go from bold, which is a heavier version, to a light or a regular font within the family. So you could highlight, you could create the highlights in that particular way by using bold or italics, uppercase or lowercase or spaced out or like sort of spaced in. It really depends. So you can do a lot with 1 font family, but I would say as a general rule, don't use more than 3. You really want, at the end of the day, 1 main font and 2 highlights and 1 body font. So make sure your body font is legible and easy to read, hence no scripts. Choose fonts which have a big family. So this is where they'll have different weights. So they'll go from black, extra black, heavy, semi-bold, demi-bold, bold, regular, light, book. So there's lots that some families have lots of different weights. And so they're different thicknesses in the actual type itself. Changing the weight or italicizing can give you more options. Script fonts could be used sparingly, and avoid having too many loud fonts. So if your fonts are extra decorative, choose one that might have a little bit more going on, but keep the other ones fairly quiet to allow that one to shine more than the others, so they're not all competing for the attention visually. And don't go for trendy fonts because your brand is everlasting and it's not really about creating something that fits the trend. And what you can do is always skip a weight. So this is where we're looking at the different font families. So light, regular, medium, bold, extra bold. If you were to choose one, say for example, it's your primary, you would choose maybe like bold, for example, for your primary font or your primary typeface. And then you would always skip a weight for the accent or the body. The reason we do this is so that there is enough distinction. If you look at how the thickness in the weight between medium and bold, there's not enough contrast. So again, the aspect of contrast comes into play here as well. So always skip a weight if you're looking to pair fonts. And the next thing we're going to cover briefly is how to pair fonts. We're going to pair it based on the shape, font shape, height, the width, the roundness really needs to complement each other. So if you've got a really tall, elongated font and you're trying to pair it with a squished up font, sometimes that contrast works, but often good pairings typically are ones where the shapes are similar. And we want ones that have some sort of contrast. So you might go for structurally different, say like a serif typeface is matched with a sans serif. So that creates a little bit of contrast. Or you could create a bold sans serif with a very thin serif typeface, and that will give you the contrast that you need. Avoid pairing 2 serif typefaces or 2 sans serif together. So if they're looking similar, too similar, there's not enough contrast. Contrast is really important. So this is an example of a bad pairing. So the Benton condensed is probably a lot longer and elongated. It's a little bit taller. And the Avenir is quite a rounded font. So the shapes don't actually match up. So that's an example of a bad pairing. And when it comes to a good pairing, Baskerville and Avenir, this would be a good pairing because if you look at the shapes of the letters in Baskerville, it's going to look similar in terms of width and height to the shape of Avenir, of the letters in the Avenir font. So this is an example of a really great pairing. It's subtle, but there's enough distinction because you're going from serif to sans serif to allow for contrast. Okay, typography and hierarchy. So this is just an example of the fonts that I've selected and for the client. So we've done the color palette and I've defined the fonts for her brand as well. So this is just how I would lay it out. I would have something that is a heading. I would know what my heading 2 is. I would know there's 2 heading 4s. I think that was a 3. So heading 3, heading 4, and I would have my body text. And this is basically all you would need to define because regardless of whether you're using on packaging or product, posters, websites, you should have enough here to allow you flexibility to put all the different elements together when it comes to your fonts and your typography. Places to purchase fonts. I mentioned Google Fonts. It's commercial free, so that's a free option, which is great. If you have Adobe Fonts or you have Adobe Creative Cloud, a subscription for Adobe Creative Cloud also gives you access to Adobe Fonts, so you can switch and activate the fonts on and off there. Creative Market is also really good because it has affordable typefaces and fonts available for licensing as well. You just need to check the license agreements to make sure that you're choosing commercial licensing rather than personal because you're running a business. And if you need more inspiration for font pairings, typewolf.com and fontjoy.com are wonderful resources to help you with that as well. Okay, great. Let's continue. So step 8 is applying your logo. So now that we've defined the color palette and your fonts, we're going to apply your logo. And this is really about seeing some of the pitfalls and the little traps that we can get into when we're applying our logo. I would say that if you don't already have a logo created, then the sort of basic place to start, if you're not going to work with a designer, is to probably use your logo based off your main typeface. So the primary typeface that you chose, use that and iterate upon it to create your logo. And that's basically what I would recommend. If you do have the funds to work with a designer, then you could go through the whole process and create a more integrated solution for your brand identity. But for a lot of businesses, I think for maybe even my own business, I've just used my typeface that I use as my logo, and I haven't really done anything fancy with it. Later on, I added a logo mark to pair with it. The option is to add a different logo mark to pair with the text. And if you're using the main typeface, you could create that in your color palette colors. So that gives you another level of identity and recognition for your brand. The best practice, of course, is to create different variations of your logo, because you want it to suit different applications. So for example, if your logo is going to be really small, you want a variation of your logo where you can use it at a small size. Likewise, if you've got a billboard or a signage, then you might want your logo to be really large, in which case you might have a more complex version of your logo for those particular instances. For something like a website, you might just want a rectangular logo rather than a circular logo so that you could put it in the navigation and it doesn't really make the navigation bar too clunky or cluttered. You want to be able to understand or check at least to see that you are able to identify your logo at small sizes. There's been so many logos that are way too complex and too detailed that if you shrink it down to the size of a 5-cent coin, is it going to be easily distinguishable? Can you see the detail? And if your eyes are going a bit blurry trying to look at it, it's too small and you need to simplify that logo. And can it fit the space I wish to apply? So that's what we said before about the rectangular logo for the navigation bar, or a circular logo if you're using stamps a lot of the time. So here's an example of the Laurie Moskal logo. So we've got a primary logo. This is the different variations. I've got one with the tagline, so Laurie Moskal and Somatic and Equus Coach underneath. We've got Laurie Moskal with her icon, and then we've got the secondary, which is the rectangular. So we want different versions of that. In addition to this, what I typically do with my clients is, this is just one batch of logos. I also create something so that she can use it at smaller sizes. So it doesn't have her name on it, but it has her icon that is essentially her logo. So keep in mind that your logo is not just one logo, it's made up of different, it's a family, right? You've got different arrangements and variations that come with it. So these are the icons that also come with her logo. So there's a primary one for larger applications, there's a secondary one for smaller applications, and for really tiny 5-cent coin applications, we've got the tertiary one, which she uses on Instagram. So that's an example of that. And this is how you can kind of see all of them together. So I typically, for my clients, I let them know that certain logo arrangements are going to be better for large applications, and that the icon is really good for large and medium applications, just so she knows how she's going to apply it, and then also keeping in mind the other smaller ones for the smaller applications. So that's just something to think about, that your logo has maybe 3 different sizes or a few arrangements to suit the different contexts that your business needs. The practice here is to allow enough space. So I typically give this as part of a brand style guide to all my clients, and it's to ensure that we have enough space between the logo and the icon, as well as the other things that are going to be placed around it. So we really want to give the logo a little bit more space, because if you're cluttering it up, then it doesn't make it feel special. The thing about branding is space makes something look more premium. So keep that in mind with design. Space allows for something to look more premium. If you look at everything that is premium, typically has a lot of space around it. And is it clear and visible? So these are some of the no-nos for logos. So you need to be sure how you're actually going to use it. If you're using it in a way where you're squishing it up, then it essentially breaks the effectiveness and recognition and consistency for your logo. If you're using a whole bunch of colors that's not part of your color palette, then that's also not going to be very effective. If you're swapping other elements in that isn't really part of the brand identity kit, then it's going to dilute your brand. Adding things like shadows are probably not a great idea because it blurs the edges. Putting it over a busy background means that your logo is getting lost against it. And if you're not really clear about the spacing in the last example on the right, the text below it is really tight and it's not giving the logo enough space to breathe. So these are just some of the things that we need to be aware of. And then you also need to understand, yeah, I think we've covered this already, whether it works in different contexts. So this is just an example of how her logo is now applied to different areas of her brand, her website, her stationery, in a way that's cohesive and keeps the color palette as well. We also want to reiterate the importance of using the colors and to allow her logo enough variation or enough contrast, really, when you're applying the logo with a background color that is part of your color palette. So make sure you keep that in mind. And if you're working with a designer, ensure you are getting the PNG, JPEG, PDF, and EPS files. Sometimes you need to pay extra for the EPS files if you're going to edit them or they're editable. So just keep that in mind. But let your designer know also if you plan to use a printer so they can actually provide you with the right color coding for printing. So if you're printing Pantone, it will require a different color coded into the EPS files. So if that doesn't make sense, let me know afterwards. I've got my details in the worksheet that I'll put on the screen. So make sure you get in touch if you have any questions. And then almost towards the end, we've got imagery, illustration, and textures. We really want to use this to leverage the emotional power of photography. And when it comes to imagery, illustration, and textures, it's really a support for your brand. It's really like the backing vocals, I would say. It's really important, but it shouldn't be distracting. So I would typically start with your mood board as a reference for the creative direction and the type of photography, images, and textures that you're going to choose. The best practice would be to choose imagery or an illustration style that is in alignment with your mood board. And if you're working with a photographer, it's really great to send your mood board to your photographer so they understand the creative direction that you want to head in. So they can take photos that align with that direction as well. When it comes to textures, that's really great if you need to add visual depth to your brand, rather than always just having it against one like sort of colored background. You can actually use lots of different textures blended together to create a little bit more depth in a way that's subtle without it taking the focus off your product, your brand, or the text. So make sure it doesn't divert or I guess it's not so strong that it is distracting. Here's an example of textures underneath. So the reason why this works is that the contrast of the letter of the logo is white, and we've used quite a dark background. So there's enough color contrast between the texture and the logo for it to work well together. This texture is also something, I guess, that shouldn't be too distracting, but should still create depth and convey that feeling that we want, which it does, and aligns with her mood board as well. An example of how textures could be used in packaging and materials is in this particular example. Notice how it's really subtle. Even the material that they've chosen for the packaging has texture on it, as well as an additional texture illustration element that is underneath. It's subtle, it's still clean, but it creates a little bit more depth for her brand, for her product. And the resources for this is Unsplash, amazing resource. All of those images on the right is from Unsplash. It's just from me searching coffee. They're commercial-free photography. You'll find some really good textures there. So it's really great for if you don't want to work, or you're not at the stage where you're going to work with a photographer. You can always get commercial-free images and photography from Unsplash. Creative Market and Etsy is really good for illustrations, textures, and icons as well. So last step, before we go into questions, if we have any at the end, is to create your layouts. So it's really about putting it all together. These are all of those elements that we spoke about. This is where everything comes together. And I love talking about layouts because it's really about hierarchy and knowing what to focus on first, and knowing how to direct people's focus as they move through one part of the page or product to another part of the page or product. So main priority here is readability and also allowing your viewer to find the story within your layouts as well. So we want to consider what people will look at, and for a website, this will be typically they're going to roll from the top of the website all the way to the bottom, or from a product perspective, they might start at the front and then the back, right? So you want to guide someone's view, and that creates a cohesive experience. You're also going to, I would recommend opting for left aligned text if you're using a lot of text, because our eye typically goes back to the same spot. Whereas if you are centering your text, your eye has to work a little bit harder to know where the start of the next sentence is. So therefore, left aligned text speeds up readability. So that's just something that we typically recommend when you're dealing with huge chunks of text. And you are also going to use maybe center text. If you really wanted to do that, I would use that sparingly. So for headings and things like that, it's okay. If there's little sections of text and a button, that's okay as well. So here's an example of the different ways that our eyes are going to go across the page on something like a website. Also happens on packaging as well, and brochures, posters, all of that kind of thing. You're going to go through an F pattern. So you're going to start at the top, work your way to the right, go back. It's almost like a zigzag rather than an F, but it is a clear pattern of recognition as we scroll down the page. So that's something to keep in mind. So what it really means is that some of your most prominent words should be up the top. That's why we put headings and titles way up the top, because it's catching someone's attention. You don't want your heading or your title or something really important to be all the way down the bottom of the page, because they're going to look at that last. So think about what you want people to see and understand first, second, and third. So another example would be the Z pattern, which is, I would say both of them are pretty much the same, because really your eye kind of drifts in the same way. But again, going from left to right and then further down the page. I would also say that for some books, they do, in some languages, they would write from right to left. So again, keep in mind your audience and what is most appropriate for them. Always think about your audience first and your ideal customer, your best customer, and use them to help you make the best decisions when it comes to your visual brand. Okay. Now this part is really about understanding hierarchy. So we want to consider the application and how someone will interact with it to determine what needs to draw their focus first, second, and third. When we're looking at hierarchy, generally, the bigger the focus, so if you want someone to see something first, you're going to make that element, it could be text, it could be imagery, you want to make that large. The larger the thing, the more it's going to hit someone as soon as they see it. It's going to take up more of their focus. With typography, things like bold typography or heavy type weights or font weights also work well. Bright colors really attract a lot more of your focus than if you're using muted colors. Make sure you have a lot of space around that element, and generally less elements around that. So the more cluttered something is, the smaller the focus. You're going to get distracted by all the other things. If it's just one thing, there's nothing else around it, it's going to capture someone's attention and keep their attention for longer. If it's a smaller focus, so maybe it's the paragraph text or it's like fine text, think about fine text or small print, small elements, thin typography. Sometimes the colors are a little bit muted. It's not as obvious. It doesn't hit you in the face. There might be more clutter. So by clutter, we mean more elements around it. It might be a paragraph. So there's more elements in terms of like a paragraph having a lot of text. That, I would say, typically has less focus or is lower in the hierarchy for me to see first, second, or third. If you think about how you would naturally read something, your eyes scan and you look at the things that capture your attention. They typically tend to be the bolder things that are bright and larger. So keep that in mind. And the other thing is to use repetition in your layouts to create a sense of order and structure, which I'll show you a little bit in a second. And the other thing to break design in a good way is to occasionally switch things up to create interest and delight. So even though repetition is great because it creates this sense of order and structure, but also expectation, it's almost this familiarity. You do want to switch things up a little bit every now and then. Maybe use a different color for your type, or use a bolder typography to call out certain words, just to create a little bit of interest and delight rather than having the same monotonous repeated structure in your layouts. So hopefully that makes sense so far. And here's an example of the hierarchy and repetition as well. So consider what is most important for someone to see or do. So you notice here there's a lot of space around it. So immediately it suggests that people's focus should go towards the center of the page. The background is not really distracting. It's not really in your face. So my focus is not going on the background. The boldness of the buttons, however, is a darker color. It's a bolder, brighter color. So it's going to attract some attention. Same with the little buttons up the top, but they're kind of muted in their color. They're a softer palette. So I would say they're almost accents to catch people's eye. And I really want people to see somatic coaching, equus coaching. I want people to read those words first. So that's why the text in those particular words is a lot larger than the paragraph of text underneath it. This is hierarchy. And when it comes to repetition, you can see that the structure is the same. If the structure for these ones were really different, I would kind of get a bit confused and almost treat the second part or whichever was different in a very different way. It would take my brain a little bit of time to try and understand the context of that if they were very, very different. If somatic coaching and equus coaching were treated really differently, I think that would be a bit confusing, hence the repetition in this particular case. And this is a section from her website, my client's website, and it's repeated twice in different places. And for the second repetition, I've actually changed the background. So it was just a little tweak to make things a little bit different. Okay, final slides. Negative space tends to create more of a premium look and feel. So as you can see from the example, lots of space around it. It's really going to direct your eye specifically only to those elements that are around, that are in the center of all of that negative space. Centered alignment also feels comfortable and ordered. So that's just something to think about. And then your eye in this particular instance will move from the top to the bottom. Here's an example of busy and cluttered. But what you can see is that the main thing is this product, which is the Havana thong. It's actually taking up so much space. So it's really calling to me. It's also very different in that it's a three-dimensional object or a photo of a three-dimensional object. Whereas everything else around it is kind of in that grid structure, but there's a lot going on. So it's almost like my mind is not really looking at that first. I'm looking first to the boldness and the color, the bold, bright color of the Havana first, and then I'm looking at the logo. So I'm going from top to the bottom right corner, and then my eye is kind of led around the page. Okay, so really, just to summarize a lot of what we've already talked about, we really want to allow people enough spacing so that they can focus on what we want them to see. Keep in mind that too much information on text on the one page can feel too overwhelming, chaotic, and busy. But too little information in one area means that it's not really clear where your eye needs to go next. So if you've got all the space on your website and you're not directing it, you're not linking it to the next thing, people's eyes are going to go and find the next thing that's there, but it's going to be a little bit confusing. So you just want to keep that in mind. And it's really about how are you leading the viewer's eye to tell your brand story most effectively. And then here's just a final example of how we're grouping the elements together for context. So there's separate sections. There's a lot of text here. So we've had to really group these elements together so that we feel like they're all in context. Otherwise, if it was all together and it was all squished up and there wasn't any spacing around it, it really wouldn't feel, it would feel really confusing. There's too much going on. So by breaking it up into sections, it makes it a little bit easier to digest a lot of information. So basically, all in all, to summarize, you really want to be using effective spacing, but not just effective spacing. You want to be using all of these visual basic elements to help your brand feel and look more consistent and cohesive. This is the ultimate aim because this really builds brand trust, loyalty, recognition, and awareness. It's a slow process. So just keep that in mind as well. It's not something that is going to, building a brand takes time, and iterating your visual identity also takes time as well, but it's so worth it because people really understand what your brand is all about and they can connect to you from an emotional perspective as well. So just in summary of everything that we've covered, we've got the brand personality, which we did in step 1. We also looked at defining your core values. We looked at really understanding your customer profiling, which is really important to understand what your customer loves, and differentiation, which is that X factor to understand who your competition is and how you actually stand out. We then broke this down into the mood board or creative direction. Step 6 and 7 was looking at color palette and defining your typography, starting with the one main type or font and defining your one main color to start off with before you move on to accent colors and secondary and accent typographies or fonts, sorry. Step 8 was looking at where to start with your logo. So if you're in doubt with where to start with your typography and use that in your logo first. Or if you're working with a designer, then they will guide you through that process where you can actually create something a little bit more complex as well. And then looking at how you're actually applying that logo effectively so that you're not stretching it and making it disappear against your background, giving it enough space and contrast. And step 9 was illustration and imagery and texture as supporting elements to your brand identity. And finally, step 10 is putting it all together, layout and hierarchy, and really see how that's important as well. So hopefully this was informative and it helped give you a very thorough, it is a lot of information, a very thorough understanding into the brand visual basics to elevate your branding. And I think that's my last slide. Okay, yeah. So the last slides really is all about the free brand worksheets. I don't know why this is scrambled, but it's free worksheets for Elevate Your Brand. Apologies for the scrambling of the text. It is on Google Docs. So what you will need to do on Google Docs is really go into that document. I'm going to paste the link here again. But basically, if you go into that document, you can make a copy of it and then start actually answering some of the prompts that I created at the very start of the presentation for you to understand things like your core values and your brand personality and your customer profiling as well. So all of the things that we talked about at the very beginning, that's available in the Branding Visual Basics worksheet. So I'm just going to put it up as a sticky message here. I don't know if you can. So hopefully, if that works, and it should work, you can go into that file and then copy. So just go File, make a copy, and then that will give you access to all the things that we covered today. So we've got 15 minutes left to go through any questions. So does anybody have any questions? Yeah, so Kylie Kennedy says, is there any way we can get access to your slides? Yes, so all the slides are available after the presentation. So I'm going to send this out and then you can actually download the slides and have a look at it again because there's lots of good stuff in there. Jenny says, I help people read ingredients lists on package to identify food additives, and we often find products where the manufacturers use colors such as yellow text on green or white background, which is really difficult. Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes it feels obvious when we actually talk about the necessity for contrast and visibility and readability in text, but it's not actually something that people tend to keep in mind. Jenny also says, thank you for all your questions, actually, everybody. It's really nice to see everybody here. These harmony wheels are really interesting. So she's talking about the color harmonies to help you define the pairings. So those are really great places to start when you're looking for the pairings for different color palettes, or how to actually define your color palette, starting from that primary color. And Joycelyn asked, what is the workbook that we're speaking to? So if you just click on the link in the sticky right up the top, that will give you access to the workbook that we are talking about here. Thank you so much, Sonia. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. So I apologize because my nose is a little bit runny. I think it must be allergies. So I'll just see if there's any other questions. Okay, great. So I just wanted to remind you, everybody, that I still have a few hours available for the mentoring. So if you're interested in having a one-on-one chat with me to see what we could do about elevating your brand, I'd love to help you with that. And we also have an incredible range of other people that are mentors, all poised to help you with your brand and your business when it comes to the digital side of things. So if you haven't already claimed your 4 hours, please do so. And if you have any questions that come from using the workbook or answering the questions, I've left my email there as well. So feel free to get in touch. Paul said, if you thought your logo didn't work on a white background, would you say it needs to be revamped? Yeah, great question, Paul. So if you thought your logo doesn't work on a white background, would you say it needs to be revamped? It depends a little bit on the logo. If it was really complex and it just isn't visible, there's not enough contrast, it might not be the color, it might actually be the shape of the logo. So you would potentially simplify it if it was too complex. But if it was a color, you could probably choose, in your color palette, you would choose to have a color that's a little bit darker so that it allows for contrast. You could still, and this is why we have, like, in the color palettes, we have the a primary color, and then you have several other colors to choose from. It's because of the different contexts, so that you can have a lighter color on a darker background, or you can have the option of using a darker color on a lighter background. So that's really good to keep in mind as well. I would also always have one black logo, just simple black, because sometimes we print in black and white, and one which is just white. So that makes it a lot more effective because you've got a suite of different colors for your logo. Okay, great. All right, excellent. Thank you so much. We will wrap this up now, and feel free to get in touch if you have any specific questions about elevating your brand, or if you wanted to book in your workshop, make sure you do that as well via the ASBAS program. I think that's all the questions that we have today. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. I hope this was helpful. And you'll also receive, remember, you'll receive the link again to the workshop slides, as well as the worksheets to copy and use after this as well. I'll also be running a few other workshops on elevating your brand. So the other ones that we'll look at is more around brand voice, as well as the mission, vision, and values side of things. So I'm really excited to present those as well. So keep an eye out for them later in the month. Excellent, everyone. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye.